I bet you never knew that the Sermon on the Mount helped India to become a modern nation. Now, how exactly did that happen? You're going to find out in this video. And you're also going to find out why some Christians don't like to put their hand on a Bible and swear in a courtroom. You know, I swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Some Christians will not do that. They will not put their hand on a Bible. We're going to find out why. But let's read a bit more of the Sermon on the Mount first. Again, you have heard that it was said to the ancient ones, you shall not make false vows, but you shall perform to the Lord your vows. But I tell you, don't swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is the throne of God, nor by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Neither shall you swear by your head, because you can't make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything more than that is from the devil. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist him who is evil, but whoever strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone sues you to take away your coat, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and don't turn away from him who desires to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, and bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who mistreat you and persecute you, that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even tax collectors do that? If you only greet your friends, you're not doing anything more than anyone else. Don't even tax collectors do that? You shall be perfect, therefore, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And I wasn't actually going to talk about being perfect, and I won't, but it's not the English word perfect. It's the Greek word teleos, which means complete. We'll talk about being complete later on in the Bible. Keep following us in these Bible videos. But in this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, don't take vows. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else than that comes from the devil, comes from the evil one. So sometimes, so Jesus is basically saying, don't make all these contracts, say, I promise to do this and sign your life away. Don't make up all these extra words of what you will and you won't do. Just get into the habit of saying yes or no and doing your best to be honourable to what you have said. Otherwise, anything more comes from the devil. Now, I got to admit, I don't quite understand how taking vows is from the devil. But Jesus said it. And so when you go to a courthouse, you may have been to court and you might have seen a Christian get called on to be a witness. And in Australia, it's not as much of a thing, but in America, it was definitely a thing, at least until recently, where people put their hand on the Bible and they say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And something about, the Bible, putting your hand on the Bible was supposed to make it, extra special. But the thing is, a lot of people in court, putting their hand on the Bible doesn't make any difference. They still just say, sometimes people deliberately perjure, they lie on oath. But because of this verse, there are a significant number of Christians that will not take that oath. And so they've got some kind of a modified form of that for court, where they basically ask them, are you willing to tell the truth? And they say, yes. It's something like that. But I remember when I first heard of that, I thought, how could they not take the oath? They're a Christian. Well, now you know why. It's because Jesus himself is the one who said not to do it. And I think the reason is because we have got the words of God here, But when we take oaths, it's like we're making up extra words to live by. It's kind of like making up our own laws as well as God's laws to live by. We don't need to make up our own laws, our own sets of words, our own contracts or oaths or vows. We've got the Lord's words, and we can live by them. His words are sufficient for us. And so then Jesus moves on to this section where he talks about if someone slaps you, let them slap you again. Now, that's an interesting thought. And I had this man in my church in Mount Morgan years ago, and he was telling me that when he was a young Christian, he was in a situation once where he was fighting. He got caught up in a fight or something. Someone hit him, and he said to them, "Hit me again." And they punched him again. And then after they'd punched him the second time, he punched them a beauty. And he said, "You know what? Jesus said to let him slap you a second time, but after that, you can do whatever you want." No, you can't. You can't do whatever you want. That's not what Jesus was saying. He was not saying let them punch you twice first and then you can get them. No, what he was saying was this whole passage, this whole section is all about having an attitude towards others, which is kind of open toward them. Like if someone says, "Can you carry my bag for a mile?" Carry it for 2. Roman soldiers in the times of Jesus, Roman soldiers were always carrying their bags around, but by law, they were allowed to ask someone to carry their bag for a mile. And I guess that saved the Romans from getting worn out. Like if they're doing long marches, all along the way, they could get people to carry their bag for a mile and walk with them. And then by law, they had to release that person, but they could ask someone else. So the Romans would get the help. Well, a lot of people didn't like helping the Romans, especially Jewish people. But Jesus says, if someone, he doesn't say a Roman, but it's pretty clear, in the minds of Jewish people, they knew what he was saying. He's saying, if a Roman asks you to carry your bag for 1, have a heart. Carry it for 2. Help the guy out. The poor bloke is keeping your country safe. Now, you might not like the Romans, but there's a Roman peace. And there's law and order because of these guys. Help the man out. So Jesus is trying to put you into the mind of having... So many people have what's called an introspective heart. Everything is focused on me and my needs and looking after myself. And Jesus is trying to get the focus to go out and say, help him. He needs his bag carried. Don't just do the bare minimum. Help the guy out. Anyway, Mahatma Gandhi, the guy who was the key figure in India becoming a country, he read the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, and this section of the Sermon on the Mount, impressed him. This part in particular about if they slap you, let them slap you again. Mahatma Gandhi really thought about this, and he came to conclude that Jesus was the perfect person. And he came to conclude that he wanted to be like Jesus. The only problem was, he looked around at Christians around him, they weren't doing a very good job of following Jesus. So he thought, I want to be like Jesus, but I don't want to be like these other Christians. And so he had some blockages which stopped him from becoming a believer. He didn't become a Christian, but he loved the Sermon on the Mount and he loved Jesus. And so he developed this idea of non-violent resistance. And it comes out of the Sermon on the Mount. So Mahatma Gandhi, he's famous, in the 40s, and India becomes a country, I think, in what year was it? Is it 48? Not 48, 65? My history's gone blank on India. But Mahatma Gandhi is, he's the one who wouldn't resist with violence, but he would resist with non-violence. So if there was something that was being done wrong, the British were overcharging with taxes, they wouldn't attack and fight them, but they would resist with just saying, no, that's not right. But then the British would attack them and be mean to them, but they would do nothing back. They'd be slapped, but they wouldn't slap back. And this creates this overwhelming, it gets a lot of attention. And so Gandhi's non-violent resistance ended up having this profound cultural effect that transformed India, and it became a modern nation. It's obviously a much more complicated story than that, but it's a fascinating one. I went to India twice, 2013 and 2017, and when I was there in 2013, I got the biography of Mahatma Gandhi in the airport, and I read it. I was so fascinated, but also so frustrated because the Christians that he met were so thick. They didn't, I'm not blaming them, but it just never occurred to them that their behavior was affecting this guy in such a way, and it was a stumbling block to him becoming a believer. But even despite that stumbling block, the Sermon on the Mount so impactful. And India, the modern nation of India, has been strongly affected by Christian ideas and continues to be so to this very day. If you want to hear some good messages on this, the guy I listen to is Vishal Mangalwadi. I've listened to some of his YouTube channel. I've read one of his books. I highly regard that man, an Indian believer, but he... just listen to him. Vishal Mangalwadi. His book is called The Book That Made Your World. Amazing. The Sermon on the Mount, it helped to create the modern nation of India with ideas like, if someone hurts you, don't hurt them back. And then we get down to the end of this chapter, and what is the strangest, maybe the hardest commandment of all? Jesus says, love your enemies. He says, do good to those who hate you. Think right now, who hates you? How can you do good to them? What can you do for the people who hate you that's good? Well, see, people don't want to go there. They don't want to even think that. In fact, they don't naturally think that. But what could you do? How could you serve them? Well, see, this is what Jesus says to do. I remember in Mount Morgan, we had, in our church, there was a house right next door, and the man that rented that house hated us. I think what happened was when he rented the house, he didn't realize that the church next door was a live, functional church. I think he thought it was just an old church building on a corner. But, we used to have our worship times on Sunday morning. Christian music would fill the neighborhood. And we would have prayer times. And there was a functional Christian community there in Mount Morgan. And I've told his story in my book, Sermons on the Mount. But he, one day, he sneaks out and during a service lets down all 4 tires on my car. So I couldn't drive home. Another time he went into our toilets and filled the toilet up with concrete. So we arrived for church. He did it through the week. We arrived for church and no one can use the toilet. And while our service was going on that Sunday, one of our parishioners, Corey, is out there with a cold chisel, chiseling the concrete out of the toilet bowl for about an hour. And another time he snuck across and turned the power off in the middle of our worship. So this guy hates us. And so we discussed this because, Jesus says, love your neighbor. He's our neighbor, but he also says, love your enemy. He's our enemy and our neighbor. We had a discussion in church. We decided, what are we going to do? How are we going to love our neighbor, who's our enemy? And we collected an offering for him. And then we decided we would secretly give it to him. Now, that was, I think, probably a mistake. We probably should have let him know that we're giving it to him. But, we, for a few months, we went through this journey of a number of things we did to show him love. The whole entire church started being friendly. When we would see him, we'd wave. We prayed for him. But in his case, it hardened his heart, and he broke his leg and smashed his car, and he didn't have insurance to fix his car, and lost his car and lost his job. And it seemed like the more we tried to love the guy, the worse things got for him. And then Paul says that in Romans somewhere. He says, by doing good deeds for your enemies, you heap up burning coals on their heads. We never thought of that, but it's like their conscience is so troubled. It's not that when they get to hell they'll have a worse time. It could be that, but it's just now. It's like when you do good deeds for those who hate you, one of two things will happen. Either the good deeds will get through to them and be this like powerful witness, or in the case of this guy, the guilty conscience builds up on you and you become so troubled and the hatred gets worse. And then, of course, the Lord dealt with him and he ended up leaving. And but that idea of loving your neighbour, where's it come from? Right here in the greatest sermon of all time, the Sermon on the Mount. By loving your enemy, you will do good for them and you don't know what the result will be. And maybe that they will be saved. And you know what? That's what the Lord did for us. The Lord loved his enemy, you, me. And if he hadn't done that, we would never have come to know him. And we're grateful. Father in heaven, bless my listeners. Help them to do this most hard of all commandments of loving their enemies. And right now, put into their mind and their heart an idea of what they can do. Let your grace be given. In Jesus' name, amen.